Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to Forward Heritage State Park. My name is Jim Lopes. I'm the Visitor Services Supervisor here. And we've been having a wonderful, this is the end of our season. This is our last program. This is the 35th anniversary of this park. And to celebrate the 35th anniversary, we have been celebrating the people and cultures of Fall River all season long. And we've been lucky to have a lot of great friends who know a lot about the area. And it makes a lot of sense after celebrating all the immigrants and all the industrial heritage of Fall River that today we go back to the beginning, we go back to our roots. And we go back to the first peoples who lived in the area. And our guest today is working with a project to reclaim the local history of the people who were here and before the Europeans. And I invite you today to celebrate the Sowams project with Dr. David Weed.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for coming today to learn something about the 17th century. Not a whole lot of people spend a lot of their time in the 17th century, but I do. So I can get this to advance. There we go. I began working on a project about 15 years ago to learn about the King Philip War and published a website with this long name, King Philip's War and the Colonial Contact Period in and around Barrington, Warren, and Swansea. And that's been up and gotten a lot of connection with other sites. But shortly after that, I helped to rededicate the well at the Hugh Cole well over in Warren, where I live, and then met the woman in the lower left-hand corner, Ellen Trader, who lived in Barrington, but had done a presentation on the Sowams heritage area. Just after I retired 2 years ago, May of 17, people came to Burrs Hill Park right behind my house in Warren, across from the town beach, and began digging a hole. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I better find out more about it. Well, it turns out that what they were doing was reburying burial items from 72 native grave sites that had been removed there in 1913 by then George Hale Library Director Charles Carr. Charles was an amateur archaeologist, and he was incensed by the fact that as they began putting the railroad through in 1854, more and more people were finding burial items, skeletons and things that were buried with them, not knowing what they were or why they were there. Charles had a strong suspicion that this was, in fact, a Native American burial site, and got permission from the railroad. As you can see from this is the article in the Providence Sunday Journal in August 25th, 1913. He began digging and found 42 native grave sites, many containing items such as the ones at the bottom, as well as some pictured in the newspaper article. What happened 2 years ago was that the Mashpees down on the Cape, because they were federally recognized in 2007, began to go to the various museums where Charles had sent or sold many of those items from the grave sites, and they were enabled to request those items back. The 1990 Native American Gravesite Reclamation Act, the federal law, said that they could reclaim those items, and that's what they did. So they spent a number of years, starting in 2007, going around and requesting over 600 items that had been removed from there, and got permission from the town of Warren, and dug a hole, put a crypt in, a concrete vault, as you can see there, and then a nice memorial over it, and then held a celebration there in Burrs Hill Park. So I was introduced to the fact that what I was living next to was a significant historical location. Warren has been known for, since its inception, this is as Sowams. This is the town hall in Warren, and when you go drive by it, you look up at that frieze over the front door, and you will see a sculpture, if you will, of Sowams 1621. Now, I would venture to guess that probably fewer than 10% of the population in Warren has any idea what that's all about. Well, what that's about is that Sowams, the home of the Massasoit Osamequin, was likely in Warren, or some would argue in Barrington, but clearly right in that location. That was the location of not the Wampanoags, we all hear Wampanoag, as the Pokanokets. Okay, and if you look at any map prior to 1700, you will see Pokanoket, not Wampanoag. Wampanoag doesn't appear till after the King Philip War, because the native people who survived that war were told, you cannot speak the language, you cannot identify yourself as Pokanoket. We want to expunge the term Pokanoket from the face of the earth. You can call yourself Wampanoag. And that's what's happened since then. And only in the last 20 years or so has the tribe begun to come forward and call themselves who they always were, Pokanokets. This is the tribe today. On the lower left, you'll see the Sagamore in the dark shirt and members of the tribal council. Here are other members, all with the Sagamore, and some of the celebrations that they now hold up at Mount Hope in Bristol. Well, the Pokanoket territory was not just around here, Sowams, this area that you see in the upper left-hand map, but really extended all the way up to the Massachusetts territory near Boston, included Providence, and included Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. You'll notice it did not include the Cape, and the Mashpees are on the Cape. The Mashpees did not participate in the uprising in 1675. They instead joined with the English and were rewarded with territory, which you can now find a reservation in Mashpee. The Pokanokets were a different story. If they weren't killed outright after the war, they were enslaved, and many were sent to Barbados. So you haven't heard much about Pokanoket, okay? But this, where it says Wampanoag, you need to replace that name with Pokanoket. Narragansett, the Pequots, and the Nipmucks were also in this area. People have lived here for at least 8,000, as long as 10,000 years. How do we know that? Because the glaciers receded here for the first time in about 12,000 years ago. And it would take a couple thousand years for the forest to grow and and the animals to move in, and for it to become a habitable place. There's archaeological evidence that goes back at least 8,000 years, and there's probably much more evidence that is now beneath Narragansett Bay, because the bay is much higher now. After the glaciers, the bay went out past Block Island. The land went out past Block Island. So there was no Narragansett Bay right after the glaciers. Once they receded, the ocean levels began rising, and people began moving into this area and had a very successful life here, okay? Imagine a civilization that could exist for 10,000 years without a problem, as far as we know, okay? Until, guess who started arriving? In the 1500s, these strange people coming in on these floating islands, okay? They were welcomed, at least to the extent of providing an opportunity for trade. And the native people here were always interested in obtaining new technology. So when they saw steel knives and hatchets, woven cloth, pottery, all kinds of things that they did not have, they were eager to trade, mostly furs, for that. They also traded some corn and other kinds of things. But they were also happy to see those European traders leave. Okay, they didn't expect them to stay, but then what happened in 1620? It wasn't just the usual shipload of men. There were women and children aboard. This was going to be different. This group of pilgrims arrived just after what's called the Great Dying. There was an epidemic that wiped out over 90% of the native population along the coast of Massachusetts. When the Pilgrims arrived in Patuxent, or what we call Plymouth, they found nothing but bleached bones on the ground because there weren't enough people alive to bury the dead. Somerset, who had been taken by one of the traders back to England and learned English and then came back to his village, was shocked to find out that everyone he knew was gone. Okay? This was a devastating event for a lot of reasons, in particular because not only had the Massasoit lost his warriors, he had also lost the knowledge base that the elders had that lived in that area. The Pilgrims, however, took this as a sign from God, preparing the way so they could just move into this nice village area that had cleared land, suitable for growing crops, and a wonderful place for them to start their new life. The Massasoit and his remaining men stayed at a distance until the following March, keeping an eye on things, and they were fearful that what happened to their relatives in the Great Dying might also happen to them, so they were very cautious. But eventually decided to make contact, and through Somerset were able to translate for one another, and held a meeting with Charles Carver, the then governor, in which a treaty was spelled out. They met on March 22nd and then came back on April Fool's Day, 1621, to sign an agreement. It was the first agreement anywhere in North America between colonial settlers and the native population. And it essentially guaranteed that this Wampanoag Treaty guaranteed that they would not harm one another, that they would protect one another from their common enemies. And that treaty stayed in effect for 50 years. It's celebrated on a U.S. coin. This is the only acknowledgement that I can find of the U.S. government of this treaty. And this is on the back of the Sacagawea dollar coin. Most people know about that, but they don't turn it over. And if they do, they see Wampanoag Treaty with no explanation. It really should say Pokanoket Treaty. But in any case, that treaty guaranteed the survival of the English and of the Pokanokets for 50 years, half a century. Ed Winslow, who was essentially the Secretary of State for the Mayflower Group, decided that he needed to go meet this guy, Osamequin, at his home. So he and Hamden and a native guide took them on a walk from Plymouth down to, we'll say Warren, if not Warren Barrington, to Sowams, where they met with the Massasoit. That is acknowledged by Virginia Baker and Guy Fessenden, who said, well, the Massasoit must be living in a village on the Warren River where there's a spring, and we'll call that the Massasoit Spring, and we'll put a nice monument there, and that'll settle it, right? Well, then Tom Bicknell from Barrington said, no, I've got proof from the documents I've been examining that the Massasoit was living in Barrington across the river. We're talking a few hundred yards difference, okay? And the idea that the Massasoit only lived in one village is kind of bizarre, because if you know the native culture, they did not stay in one place for long periods of time. They would run out of fish and wood and fowl and animals to hunt and things of that sort. So they were always prepared to get up and move their settlement to another location, and would do that over and over and over again, sometimes returning to a previous occupied settlement, but there was no permanent village. Remember, their houses were weetus, built out of saplings with cedar, and the frame could be left there, and then you take what you want. But they did not take a lot with them because it made no sense. They would find our ways. You know about the American obsession with things, okay? That would be totally bizarre to them. They had to carry everything that they owned. So, translation, you don't own a lot, right? Smart people. Winslow came back 2 years later in 1623 when he heard news that the Massasoit was ill. And he wanted to at least see him before he died. He thought, he heard on the way that he had died, but fortunately had not. And then encountered him in his weetu, surrounded by his people who were moaning and wailing because they thought he was going to die. He was blind, he couldn't eat, they thought this was the end. But Winslow gave him some European concoctions, even ordered some chicken soup to be made, but they didn't have any chickens. So, and lo and behold, the Massasoit recovers, gets his eyesight back, and says to Winslow, "Winslow, you'll be my friend for life." And he stuck to that, okay? There's an interesting theory I just read recently that what may have happened is, and we don't know, is that there was a Dutch trading ship that had been there. That's part of the reason Winslow wanted to go down there. The Dutch had left after they got the ship that had been aground in the Warren River. And one theory is that these, the Massasoit had were symptoms of botulism, which only comes from badly stored food. It doesn't occur in nature, okay? And it may be, his speculation is that the Massasoit got food given to him by the Dutch. Of course, they took off. Nobody knows. It's just an interesting theory, right? So this is what Sowams looked like back then. That's Barrington up in the top right there, but with the town and the Stanley Boatyard erased, and some weetus in a small village there with a little Dutch trading ship off in the water there. I just did that using Google Maps and erasing everything and do a little Photoshop work, and you see the land was open and cleared. And I always had the idea that the land back then was wooded, heavily wooded and dense. Not true. It's clearly described as open land, pasture land, okay? So I opened up the land, and this is what would be Warren back then, called Brooks Pasture. There was a trading post set up, I think probably near the Kickamuit River, not on the Sowams River or the Barrington River now, but nobody knows. That's the Hoxie House down on the Cape. So this is what the place looked like back about that period of time. Miles Standish, he was the military leader of the Pilgrims. He came down and was totally impressed with the area, described Sowams as the garden of the patent and the flower, notice how flower is spelled, of the garden. Basically saying he loved the fact that there was land that was open that could be used to raise crops and, most importantly, to graze their animals, okay? So this is perfect. He even bought land, though, in what's now Warren, but never occupied it. 1636, another visitor to the area, none other than Roger Williams. I just spent all day last Saturday with an all-day conference on Roger Williams over at Smith's Castle in Wickford, but Roger had come down from Salem in the winter of 1676 because first he came from England in 1631, spent a year in Plymouth, got to know the Massasoit then, Then, because they didn't agree with his point of view, he went up to Salem and thought he was going to do fine there until the authorities in Boston said, no, we don't like what you're saying about separating the church and the state, so you got to go back to England, and we're sending troops to get you. Well, he got word of that and left his home and his wife and children and walked all the way from Salem all the way down here to Warren, basically. In the winter of 1636, it was one of the worst winters known then. The entire Narragansett Bay was frozen over. It was that cold, okay? He arrived at the winter encampment of the Massasoit, which we think is just north of the Warren line in Swansea, where there was a winter settlement, and was nursed back to health because he was deathly ill and could have died at that point, at which point there would not be a Providence, there would not be a Rhode Island. Everything would have been different. But with the help of a native woman, Margaret, so-called, that's not her native name, he was nursed back to health here at Margaret's Cave. This is on private property, but I lead tours there every now and then. And the Roger Williams family has marked that as the likely location where Williams was recovered his health and left then in April of 1636 to go up to Omega Pond, upper left-hand corner there. Omega Pond is in East Providence, and across the street from that pond you will find a marker, though it's the marker up in the upper right. It's set way back, and you'll never see it unless you get out of your car and walk up there. We're going to do better and do a better marker. There are also a couple of 17th century houses in the neighborhood. But that's where Roger decided that he would start a new colony until he got word from Plymouth that he was on their territory and he had to remove. So remove he did. He went across the river, the Seekonk River. You've probably seen paintings or illustrations of him being greeted by Canonicus, the Narragansett chief, and what cheer Netop, which is, by the way, that's on the symbol of the city of Providence, on all the trucks. It says, what cheer Netop. And settled Providence. How many of you have been to the Roger Williams Memorial down on North Main Street in Providence? I see 1, 2 hands, 3 hands maybe. You should all go, 4 hands, okay? I was just there again over the weekend. It's an easy trip. It's just North Main Street in Providence. Just go up past Brown and RISD and all that, and you'll see a nice park there, big sign, and then a nice visitor center in the upper right there. And I swear you can be in and out of that in 30 minutes and see everything, okay? There's even free parking if you go around the park to the other side. So a nice stop and a good way to get introduced to what was happening in 1636 right there. Inside you'll see this painting in the lower left that it's a contemporary painting of what Providence might have looked like in 1650 or so. And if I had a pointer, I could point out different items on that, but basically what you're looking at is the Great Salt Pond, which is now where Waterfire is, okay? And then the hill to the right of that is where the State House is, that's Smith Hill. And way in the back, that green mountain is Newtoconnicut Hill, which is the western boundary of the territory that Canonicus deeded. A lot of people say, well, Williams bought the land. You have to understand that Native people didn't own any land. They didn't think anybody could own land. Land was God's gift to man and all living creatures. And the idea of ownership made no sense whatsoever to them. What they did do is have agreements about you can use this land for hunting or this place for fishing. And those agreements often took place among tribes. So when Roger said, I want this land to use to build a town, they said, fine. And they exchanged a gift. I'm I can't recall right now, it was like 36 pounds or something like that. That's not a purchase. That's simply an acknowledgement of the exchange, okay? So this idea of buying land, even though Williams continued to insist in the English way of doing things, that's what he was doing. So you can also stop at the Weybosset Bridge. There's some nice interpretive signs on the east side. That's right at the bottom of College Hill. Obviously, that's downtown Providence. That's the 8th version of a bridge that was first put there in 1660, and it was a toll bridge run by none other than Roger Williams. He was an older man at the time, didn't have a lot of money, and that's how he earned his living for a few years. Of course, the bridge then washed out in a hurricane or storm, and then they went back to wading across there. That was the one place, the first place, if you were coming from anywhere in the West Bay and wanted to go anywhere in the East Bay, that was your best route, was across that space, because at low tide you could wade across. Otherwise, you'd have to go further up the river and find another place to cross. So that became the center of town on what was known then as Town Street, and the whole layout of Providence proceeded from there. Oops. I'm not going to go into all the land exchanges and all the boundary issues and things of that sort. That would take a full hour to explain that, but at least you can get some idea of how these land purchases occurred. First was Rehoboth in 1643, and then Wannamoisett over in what's now Riverside, East Providence. Then there were purchases, the land was split between Sowams, and the Wampanoag lands became Swansea, okay? Then that land was divided between Swansea and Barrington, and then that land was, then Warren absorbed Barrington, and then Swansea became a proper town of its own, and finally by 1770 you have the current configuration of boundaries. But you'll notice that Bristol was never involved. Bristol was never, quote, sold by the native people. So 1643, the first settlement over in East Providence. The church that's there now celebrates that congregation has been in place since 1643. That's the 4th church building they've had, but you can see many of the early settlers' grave sites across the street. So that's where the English settlement in this area really began. But there were many other settlements that occurred around here. This is a map that I made for the King Philip War site, and you'll see Bristol down here. The red spots are where we know there were native occupations, okay, and including up there at Tyler Point in Barrington. But then around that, you'll see up north of the Runnins River, an English settlement, another one up near what was then called the waiting place. The Miles Garrison was there. There was a whole church there where Reverend Miles started a small settlement. Swansea, then known as Swansea Corner, then an English settlement in 1653 on the Kickamuit River in Warren. Other little settlements around there, one in Warwick, of course Providence way up in the top, and if you could see the bottom of the map, you would find Newport, which was really the large commercial center and the biggest settlement there. Have you heard that Newport was bigger than New York City? It was one of the 4 largest cities on the East Coast for a long period of time, which is why the British were so interested during the Revolutionary War. So what you get is a picture of the native population, which had been dropping precipitously over the 50-year period of time from 1620 to 1675. Probably, there are many estimates, there were no censuses taken, but we think around at least 7,000, maybe as many as 10,000 native people when the Pilgrims landed. Remember, that's after the Great Die-Off, so there were many before that. But then there were other infectious outbreaks, 1632, 1643. So the population kept dropping. So by the time the King Philip War broke out in 1675, we think there were fewer than 700 native people left living on the Bristol Peninsula. Meanwhile, the English population was exploding. They obviously started with 102 people, half of whom died after the Mayflower, but then in 1630, with a great flotilla, brought over 10 ships and over 700 people, that's in 1630, so that population in Massachusetts began growing, and by the time the war broke out, there were approximately 50,000 native English people living in New England at that time. So a huge imbalance. And if you can imagine, you start out by being the dominant tribe, very well populated and very well defended in the 1500s, now reduced to a few hundred people, okay, mostly by diseases that no one understood how to treat or prevent, and diseases that never seemed to affect the English, and they thought that was because they had some magical power. So you're down to 700 people surrounded by English people, and you realize that in another 20 years, you'll probably all be gone, okay? So what do you do? Well, there was a lot of discussion for a long period of time, but finally the decision was made to start to drive the English out of there, and the King Philip War began in Warren, right on what's now Child Street in that area, with the first shot fired against by a 12-year-old who hit the arm of a native person who was caught looting their farm, and everybody was at church, and but that was enough because the belief was that whoever draws the first blood will lose the war, so meaning the English would lose. So Philip and his men started moving over into farms in what's now Swansea and burning those farms. People were driven out to the garrison house, and word spread up to Boston very quickly. 300 militiamen came down and settled at the what's now the Miles Garrison. I don't know if you're familiar with the what used to be the Bungtown Bridge. It's now the Miles Bridge in Barneyville in way western Swansea. If you ever get a chance to go out there, there's a monument. I'll show you in a picture there. So the English came with the idea of coming down what's now Metacom Avenue all the way to Mount Hope and meeting Philip and surrounding him and stopping him from going any further. Well, do you think Philip would just stay there and let that happen? Of course not. He had plenty of time, and he and his warriors left. There was nobody left in Mount Hope. They all came down and crossed the river over to what's now Tiverton, and then went up through the swamp in Tiverton, you can't get to anymore, up along the Watuppa Pond on the east sides of the Watuppa to the Maori Trail. Anybody been on the Maori Trail? Go to Green Futures. They'd lead tours up there. And eventually across the Taunton River, and then up to Nipmuc territory in central Massachusetts, and then proceeded. You see the path of the war, a good part of it went out to western Massachusetts. I think the strategy was to simply start on the west side of all these settlements and sweep across to the Boston area and drive the English back to England. In fact, many of them did go back to England. Many also went down to Newport, which was safe territory at that point. But there's really could be no other objective. They weren't interested in living in those towns. They just wanted people out of there so they could reclaim their land and keep their culture. But they caught up with them over in Bristol on land that's now the Mount Hope Farm. Benjamin Church confronted him, fired at King Philip. His gun misfired, so a man named John Alderman, whose brother had been killed by King Philip earlier, shot he was the Massasoit at that time, shot him and killed him in the swamp. They drew and quartered his body, took his head up to Plymouth and stuck it on a pike for 20 years. That essentially ended the war, except for Anawan Rock. You can see where that event happened if you ask for directions at the Mount Hope Farm, you can walk to the marker where Philip was slain. Above that is the Miles Garrison marker that you can go to anytime at the end of Barneyville Road. They're all on the map that you'll find on the website. Anawan Rock in Rehoboth was where Philip's general, if you will, Anawan, was confronted, not killed there. In fact, he spent a night with Church trading war stories, as two good generals would do. And then Church sent him up to Plymouth thinking he'd be fine, jailed maybe. No, they killed him, So that pretty much ended the war, at least down here. It continued in some parts up into Maine for 3 more years. So what can you find around here from all that time? Anybody here from Swansea? Oh, good. You can't get there now, but there is the old Eddy burial ground there. It's privately owned, and they don't want anybody in there anymore. But there are other places that you can find with similar grave sites, and I'll show you those. Abrams Rock behind Swansea Town Hall. There's a whole park back there, and you can go on a walk. If you want to join us on the last Sunday in October, we're going to do a walk up there and go climb up on top of Abrams Rock. That's part of the 17th century Rhode Island meet-up. If you've heard of meet-ups, you just go on meetup, meetup.com, and then put in 17th century, and you'll find the page and the whole description, and you can sign up or just come to that anytime you want. But that's territory that's essentially unchanged from that period of time. How many people have gone to Johnson's Market in Swansea on Route 136? If you live over in that area, it's a very popular place. Just south of Johnson's Market, on land that Tim Johnson owns, is the rock on the upper left. That's known as King's Rock. It was also known as the National Grinding Stone because Native women would take a rock and roll it on a groove at the top of that rock where those people are standing. And you can still climb up there and see the groove where that took place. It's not marked yet, but we're going to get a marker there. There's the groove on the right. It's filled with moss. Across the street, what kind of rock is that? Anybody ever seen one? You've got one right here in town called Rolling Rock, right? That's what's known as a balanced rock or a glacial erratic, meaning that when the glaciers receded after carrying large boulders down from Canada, the ice melted and the rocks just fell where they were, and the glaciers continued to recede, and now you have these strange boulders just in weird places all over New England, okay? And there are lots of them, if you know where to look. Look it up on Google sometime. But across the street from King's Rock there on Route 136, across from Johnson's Market, on private land, but when the vegetation is no longer in the way in a few weeks, you'll see this large boulder there. And I said, that was not, it may have been a glacial erratic in that it was brought there from somewhere, but the fact that it's perched up on bedrock, and you notice the stone underneath there, there's several stones underneath there, keeping that rock up there. So I called the state geologist and I said, so Tim, what's the name of that rock? He said, oh, I don't know, it's just a glacial erratic. I said, Tim, glaciers don't put stones under the boulders that they deposit, all right? People do that. And he said, well, I don't know. We don't have any historical information about it. He said, well, that could have been a bunch of college kids who did that. I said, no, Tim, college kids aren't going to roll that kind of a rock and put that in a place that native people all over New England put large rocks like that on top of granite outcroppings, on the top of what's known as Sacham's Knoll, which is a spot, when you stand there, you can see the turbine blades of the Allens Avenue turbines in Providence with your naked eye, right there, spinning away, okay? If you look the other way, you'll see the large rock where Margaret's Cave is, okay? And you have King's Rock that's marked on 1 million maps, okay? No question about that. And this is the route that Philip traveled, because we know when the British were at the garrison, they marched down that road to Mount Hope. This is a native spot, a sacred native spot, a spot that needs to be identified, and we're working on doing that. If you know anybody who knows anything, please let me know. Also in Swansea, in fact, I think they're either just had or they're about to have another open house. They do these on Sunday over at Luther's Corners, and it's the little museum for Swansea, the historical museum. But if you go inside there, you'll find a Cahoon brick. That brick was made in Swansea just before the start of the King Philip War, along the Palmer River. And Carl Becker, who is the historical director there, fished that out of the river because they left some of the bricks that they were making along there, and he was able to find one. I've since looked, I couldn't find one. But that's also you'll find the Church of Christ there, the White Church in Swansea. That was started in 1680. Not the building, but the congregation. There's the charter for it. And you'll also, on Old Warren Road, go by the Jonathan Cole House, the oldest house in Swansea. It's not pre-1700, probably 1705, but it's definitely on land that was colonial land. I've been in that house. The woman gave me a tour of it, and there's an Indian room built into the house where you go and put the kids in the room because there are no windows and they're very thick walls, so the arrows wouldn't penetrate. That was because even 25 years after the war, people were still afraid of Indian uprisings. Okay. How many people have been to the Martin House in Swansea on Route 6? Well, I'm sorry you just missed it because they had their last event last Sunday, but it's open Sundays, July through the end of September. But it's a good example, even though it'll say 1728, we think the original house was built prior to 1700. So the Martin House is one where you can see evidence from the 17th century. I love the armor that they have up on the second floor, where you can see what the men who fought in the King Philip War were dressed like. We don't know that that particular item was used by men in the war, but it was the style of dress at the time. And just to wrap up, this is where I was yesterday. Winslow Point. How many people have heard of Winslow Point? Winslow from Ed Winslow, okay? Because Winslow, when he came down, remember on that trek in 1621, July? Okay, he had to come through here because it was really the only reasonable place you could cross the Taunton River without going way north and way out of your way. And we know that the tribe kept mashoons, or what we would call hollowed log canoes, okay, along the shore on both sides. So anyone coming from either side would always be able to get across the river at that point. So that was the route, and there's a paper by Edwin Robbins from the Robbins Museum who pretty much nails it that this is where he crossed. You go there now, and what I discovered is this is looking from Winslow Point across to Somerset. I would not want to get in a canoe and go across that half mile in wind or any other untoward conditions. It's a tough jaunt. There were native people who used to swim that at the drop of a hat, okay? So if you're not in good shape, stay away. But that's Winslow Point. You can see the map. This is all part of Peacehaven. Anybody heard of Peacehaven? It's an archaeological site. It's gorgeous land there, untouched since the 1700s, privately owned and now occupied. You see those buildings up there? That's the Stop and Shop headquarters, okay? But at least along the shore, you see a lot of unspoiled territory there. And it's something that needs to be protected. And our local historian, Al Lima, has been working very hard to see about getting Peacehaven protected. It's now protected with the Taunton Wild and Scenic River designation, okay, the Taunton River. So that helps. But it's an important place. That's where, when I mentioned earlier, when Philip needed to cross the river to escape Benjamin Church, that's likely where he crossed. It's also where later in the war, Weetamo, the queen of the Pocasset tribe, lost her life along the shore there. So, if you want to find out more, you've got your brochure. You can go to the website. On that website, you'll find an interactive map. In fact, if you go to that website on your phone, click on the first thing under the picture says click here, and you go to an interactive map. So you click on any of those sites on that map, it takes you to the web page about that. So you can do your own tour, go exploring, find places around here. We found over 50 sites. There may be more. We're still looking. The criteria is they have to be before 1700 to make it on the list. But that's the territory that we want to turn into a national heritage area and create the signage for that. We've also put together 10 little brochures, depending on what you're interested in, whether it's old houses or grave sites or whatever. All the locations are on those tours, and shows you how to get there. So I think I'm out of time. Well, it's just 1 o'clock now, so I didn't do too bad, huh? And that's the end of that. Well, I'll be happy to take some questions. Yeah.
How's the process going in getting this to be an official heritage area with the National Park Service? Is that who?
Well, no, we haven't even, we're just in the beginning stages. Okay. I'm 2 years into what I think will be a 10-year project, okay? So the first thing we've been doing over the last 10 years is informing people such as yourselves about what this is all about. Very few people who live here know anything about the history here. And although I have found people, how many people have read the book Mayflower? Okay. If you haven't, it's definitely worth a read. It's now down to like $9 on Amazon, okay? No excuse not to get it or get it from the library. But it's a great read, right? Very informative, but it's totally mistitled. It has very little to do with the Mayflower. I mean, it starts with the Pilgrims coming over, but most of it is about the King Philip War right around here. And it includes Fall River and, you know, Bristol and on up to Providence and this whole area. So it's a good introduction to the history, at least of the war at that time. And if you get more interest in that and find out more, there's lots more to read. So does that answer your question? Yeah. We'll get to, next step is to start working with businesses. And I've had meetings with the Chambers of Commerce and the Rotaries and all the communities there. And once we get a group of business people together, then we'll go to our state legislators in both states, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and begin the process of putting together legislation. National Heritage Area are usually funded at about $300,000 a year, but forever, okay? I mean, you have to keep funding them, but you don't have to keep applying. So getting through the application process is several years, and then finally when you get the designation, then you're kind of on the national map. Okay? Other questions? Oh, sorry. It's dark in here. Yeah.
I'm curious if you're working closely with the Rhode Island State Historic Preservation Office, or if you're working with the tribal.
That's one, well, both. Rhode Island Historic Preservation was one of my first meetings, and they get my emails and they open them all the time, so I think they're following along. I don't know what level of interest they have. I think they're doing watchful waiting, see where this is going, okay? There's not a whole lot that they can do anyway, other than maybe send a letter of endorsement, that kind of thing. And then the tribes, absolutely. The Sagamore for the Poconoke tribe lives in Barrington. Also, his daughter lives there. She's now the designated chief. Sagamore is kind of over the chiefs. And we got a grant from the Rhode Island Council on the Humanities last April, started doing programs in schools and had 10 different presentations with the tribe. If you want to see any of those, they're on the website. Just go to videos. You'll scroll down, you'll find videos with the tribe. They do a terrific presentation. And that's how we got the idea of doing this event coming up next June. Put this on your calendar. June 28th, Burrs Hill Park, all day, will be before the Mayflower, the rest of the story. And then the following year, also on the same weekend, the weekend before 4th of July, we'll be doing the first one is before the Mayflower, the next one is after the Mayflower, and that's when we're going to do a recreation of Winslow's visit 400 years before, and be looking for a small group of people who are willing to dress in colonial costume and walk out of Plymouth. We won't make them walk all 40 miles, but to get a little publicity, we need to have them start the walk up there and then finish the walk down in Warren. But that'll have both native and colonial events there. You can learn how to start a fire without a match, or learn how to cook Johnny cakes, or all those things from the 17th century. Other questions? I'd be happy to stick around if you want to talk to me individually. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you've learned something that will carry on your interest in the 17th century. Okay. Jim? Yep.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you all for coming today. Some of you I recognize because you come to every single program. Thank you for your support all season. But we have some honored guests, various representatives from DCR today, and I'd like to thank you for coming today. And also especially like to thank former cable media. Community media, yes, community media, because they have supported us this entire season, so that if people are working and they can't come to our programs during the day, they have the opportunity to watch them again and again online. You can go to YouTube and watch our programs, or you can find them on their Facebook page. So thank you, Fall River, for your support, and we look forward to our 36th year next year back here in Fall River Heritage State Park. So thank you. Bye bye.